So for Tab has a very fun fact. I'm sure many of you in the audience have pets of some sort, but I'll bet that you do not have the same pets as Tab used to have. His pets are a bit more of the exotic variety, and if you ask him, his favorite of the lot are ball pythons. So you can ask him about that after his talk on the future of organizing your CSS. Give it up for Tab.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. You saw me yesterday. Hope you're not tired of me yet because you're here for another 45 minutes and you cannot leave. The doors have been locked. I'm Tab Atkins-Bittner. There's my Twitter, just Tab Atkins, because Tab Atkins-Bittner is 16 letters. My website, xanther.com. And the talk today is at xanther.com/talks/today's date. If you don't remember today's date, just type in /talks. You'll find it in the directory. Quick note too, this talk is the first time I've given this one, so my timing is a little bit shaky. Feel free to ask me anything about the web development platform. I work on all of CSS, basically. Anything that I don't directly write on, I usually have an opinion on or a finger in, and I do stuff outside of CSS as well. I work on JavaScript, I do a little bit of HTML. If you know about pipeline or pattern matching proposals in JavaScript, those are my babies right now, along with a few other wonderful engineers. So feel free to ask anything that's about the web platform. If I don't know it, I might be able to point you to the right place. If I don't have time to answer all the questions, I'm going to do what Leia did and answer all of them offline. So feel free to ask whatever you want. Today, I'm going to talk about keeping your CSS small. Back in the old days, when we were first writing HTML, we didn't have very much to write about. The pages were pretty simple. Simple structures, simple CSS. You didn't have to do a whole lot, and we've kind of moved away from that. This is going to be about a couple of current and upcoming ideas that help us return at least somewhat to that early ideal. If you're familiar with any of my talks, you know that I usually like to do a whirlwind of ideas, not to go deep into any particular one. I prefer to let people know what is out there. It's better to know what questions to ask than to be given answers directly sometimes. That said, a lot of the possible ideas for this talk were already taken up by great speakers earlier in the day. So I've actually only got a handful of them here that I go a little bit more in depth in. So we'll see how this works. Once again, xanther.com/talks/today's date to follow along with some links. So like I said, back in the day, we had simple selectors. You needed to style your links. You put a pseudo class on it. You had some buttons. You styled them. You maybe threw a few classes around. It wasn't a big deal. Over time, our pages got more complicated. We had to start worrying about structure more. You wanted your buttons to look differently in your main content from in your sidebar. You wanted to care about all sorts of new states that you were tracking via JavaScript. And it just got worse from there. It kind of escalated. Suddenly you're worrying about specificity fighting. You're worrying about selector structures to help you manage all your classes. And at the end of the day, no matter how good you write your selectors, no matter how clean you write your HTML, you're still going to be left with weird hacks like important or something. What if we could, we've tried to solve this in a lot of different ways. Various CSS organizational strategies like OOCSS or Atomic CSS or BEM. We've tried to abandon a lot of selectors entirely, do CSS-in-JS and just pipe everything into inline styles. We've tried to stick to complicated design systems, trying to discipline ourselves to keep ourselves on the right track. Or we've just given up. We just do whatever the framework says because it's easy and it usually does the right thing. We can do better than that, though. So the first thing I'm going to talk about today is Shadow DOM. First, how many people here have written Shadow DOM in anger? All right, that is less than I expected, which is good, actually. This will be a great intro for the rest of you. Those of you who do know what's going on, have a little nice relaxation time. So, like I said, the problem that we've been having is that documents keep getting larger. The CSS we write keeps getting larger. And the size of your document times the size of your rules kind of multiply together, and that's more or less the performance of your page. As you double one and you double the other to advance, you get 4 times the penalty hit, the perf hit. Shadow DOM is all about taking that giant document and slicing it up into a lot of tiny documents, because tiny documents can just add together instead of multiplying together, and you get some amazing cascading benefits. So we'll go through a quick example here. I'm a D&D player, don't know who else does that, but I'm going to make a quick dice roll custom element. So we're going to start with the initial JavaScript to set up a custom element with some Shadow DOM. You start on custom elements, which is a property on window. Custom elements.define, pass the string dice roll, that'll be the name of my custom element, and then pass a class that extends an HTML element. Usually you're just going to extend the base class HTML element, but you can do more specific ones if you need it. In the constructor, you call super, as you always do when you're extending. You go grab the template. I'll explain what that is in a second. You create a shadow. You call this.attach shadow. I'm doing an open shadow root because I want to be able to style a little bit more easily, but the two details don't matter too much most of the time. And I'm going to append all the stuff in the template to the shadow root. I'm going to copy all of them, clone it out, put it in the shadow root, and then grab the button out of the shadow root. Now that I've copied it all in there, again, you'll see in a second, put a click listener on it. I'm not going to do the rest of the code because it's just another screen full and it doesn't really help. Here's the template element that it's based on, though. This is the structure that will live underneath my element. I'm going to call it dice roll, and it's very simple. It's a button. It has a slot, and I'll explain what slots do in just a moment. It has some default content. If you don't put any dice roll inside of it, you'll see this. And it's got an initially hidden span containing an output, and you'll see what it does. First of all, the usage is just make a dice roll element, easy peasy. Put a dice expression in there, and we get out of it a button. If I click this button, I get a dice roll. Now, this isn't very interesting on its own. It's a button. You can make buttons all day. It takes 5 minutes to do. The interesting thing about this, though, the reason why it's interesting to use in Shadow DOM is revealed when we inspect. Yeah, that looks large enough. If we look at the actual DOM here, we just see a dice roll element. If we open it up, we just see the text. The button is nowhere to be seen. But tab, you say, there's a shadow root there. That's not in the DOM. You can't see it with selectors. This is the important part of Shadow DOM, is that the stuff that I put in that template, the button, the output, the slot, the span, none of those are visible to the outside page. I don't need to worry about them when I'm styling the outside page. The fact that this uses a button has no bearing on any of the selectors that I write otherwise. I can write stuff that targets buttons without screwing this one up. And conversely, I can style this however I want without worrying about accidentally targeting other buttons elsewhere. So if you can't style it from outside because none of your button styles work to go inside of there, how do you style it? Easiest way is just put a style in there. Throw one into your template. Give it whatever styles you want. In this case, buttons naturally have a particular user agent defined size. I want it to instead match the font around. I've got like size 30 font or something here. If it's not individually modified, it's automatically shared. And what that means is, you might wonder, if I have a large component, if I have a decent sized style sheet, and I've got 1,000 of these things on my page, am I making 1,000 style sheets? Am I causing the browser to compute a ton of duplicates of this style sheet and waste a lot of memory on that? And the answer is not really. Every element will have a style element, or every shadow will have a style element in it, but elements are cheap. They're very small structures inside the browser. Style sheets are not cheap. They're a lot more expensive. There's a lot of underlying data structures associated with it. But because of that, browsers know how to be smart about this. As long as they see the same style sheet over and over again, they will reuse the same style sheet object underneath. So you can have 1,000 of these buttons, and they'll all use the same underlying data structures, and they won't waste memory profligately, like you might be afraid of. But because technically these are supposed to be separate, browsers use copy on write semantics. So if you ever go in and fiddle with one of these style sheets, at that point, it'll make a copy in a separate object. But who fiddles with style sheets? It's very, very rare to actually manipulate style sheets directly. The CSSOM is really bad at doing that. So we don't worry about that most of the time. But what if you do worry about it? Well, then you can make it more explicit. We can now make CSS style sheets directly in JavaScript by just calling new CSS style sheet. For legacy reasons, we can't just give it a string in the constructor like you might expect for a well-designed API. We're dealing with things that have been upgraded over time. But you can just call replace sync on the style sheet to immediately parse whatever CSS you throw at it and fill the style sheet with it. Or if you have a big style sheet and you don't want to potentially block the main thread for 50 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds of parsing, you can call just replace, and it'll give you back a promise when it's done parsing and filling it all up. Then in your constructor, you just use adopted style sheets and assign it the extra style sheet objects you want. This goes alongside the dot style sheets that you might be familiar with. That is a browser managed list of style sheets, all the things that come out of links and style elements and whatnot. So if you want to do ones manually, we have this separate bit called adopted style sheets. Also, if right here, I'm constructing them explicitly. But if you are into using ESM, JavaScript modules, you can use CSS modules. Just import the style sheet, assert that its type is CSS. The browser will do a little bit of checks to make sure that you're telling the truth. In particular, I think it just checks that it is served with a type of text/CSS. And you'll get back a CSS style sheet object. This also means it's now managed by the module graph. So if you import the same style sheet multiple times across your code base, you'll get the same object back every time, just like how in JS modules, you get the same module back every time when you import the same thing multiple times. There's a great web.dev article about using module scripts. You can also use these to import JSON, and we're doing more things with them in the TC39 organization. So check that out. So all those things I just said were about styling it from the inside, setting up the styles on the component. This is something that the component author writes, but what about the component user? They want to be able to customize things. A dice in one area might want to be formatted differently than a dice in another one. So the problem here is that encapsulation is a double-edged sword. We want to protect you from accidentally overstyling. Either way, either your outside page hitting inside or your inside styles heading out, but that means you're also protected from intentional styling. We have solutions though. The first obvious one is CSS variables. Now, I'm not going to go too much into this because Leah just took it to the mat yesterday, but for a quick example here of how you can use those, the dice roll can be set up with a couple of CSS variables. Here it's going to let you color the output bit, and it'll also track when it's a maximum or minimum value and let you specify those as well. So by default, nothing special happens. It continues to just be die rolls. But as soon as I uncomment this guy, now it's set normally it's black, it becomes cornflower blue on a max or red on a min, and it's already at a maximum value. Click it a few times, you get red, you get blue again. So this works great so long as oh, sorry, skipped one. Again, as Leah went into great detail of yesterday, in addition to keeping just setting up variables by default, you should be able to register them. It gives you great benefits, particularly in DevTools, because in this case now result max color will look like a color in DevTools. It'll present you a color picker. It'll transition. It'll animate. It'll do all sorts of nice things for you. Rewatch Leah's talk if you've forgotten. But what I just showed you was, again, dependent on the component author. They had to decide ahead of time that coloring the result was something you might want to do. They give you the choice of what the color is, but they still have to predict that that's what you're going to want. And even prediction is really underselling this. Every property that you want to be able to set with a variable has to be done ahead of time by the author. CSS has 400-something properties right now. And that's for the starters. What if you wanted to style everything differently when it's in a minimum state or a maximum state? Now that's 3 lists of 400 properties. What if you wanted to style it when it's being hovered? That's another times 2 on the 6 we already got. This just explodes. You got hover focus, you've got pseudo elements. If you want to do an after on something, now I've got to supply another set of properties. It's terrible. So we're not going to do that. This is great when you have a few easy things that you can predict ahead of time, will form a good API for your component. Being able to color the result might be a reasonable thing to offer to somebody, even if they're not wanting to do anything more complicated. But if they do want to do something more complicated, part is the solution. The spec is CSS shadow parts. It lets you advertise some bits of your shadow DOM as parts, and they'll be visible from the outside using the part pseudo element. Show a quick example. So this is the exact same template that we started with. Again, a slot that will slide the dice expression into, an output. The only difference is I've added a couple of part attributes. Part equals dice for the dice expression, part equals result for the result. Once again, no effect at first. Part does absolutely nothing. This is exactly what you saw a moment ago. But that's because none of these styles are doing anything. So first off, I want to underline the text while the button's hovered. I didn't predict ahead of time that anybody wanted to do a text decoration, but now this is working with a dice roll, hover, and then go into the part. There you go. You can clap, it's fine. But also, I can do things kind of arbitrary here. I'm grabbing the part of the result, grabbing an after pseudo element from it, doing content. This is 3 levels deep in like state stuff that would have been a crazy multiplication before. Now you can just do it whatever you want. The author doesn't have to predict it ahead of time. If I click this through back to a min state, lost it. I just want to know ahead of time. Oh, yes, perfect. Maximum result. I wanted some confetti. You might notice something else here too. The part in the first one is just a single word, result, exactly what you saw up there. In the second one, it's result and max. Part names are like class names. An element can have multiple of them. Multiple elements can have the same one. You can target all of them whenever you do this. If you specify multiple part names in the function, it's just intersecting them, like doing .result.max or something. So for this one, I just toggled the min or max part name as well, based on whether the state was. The part property in DOM is a DOM token list, exactly like the class list property. So you can call add, remove, toggle, and it's pretty convenient to work with. An important aspect of part is it does the same thing that the rest of Shadow DOM does. It hides details for you. It hides implementation details for you. Something you learn quickly when you're developing on the web is everything you expose, however minor, however accidental, will be depended on by somebody at some point, and if you change it, they'll break and complain at you. The same thing applies to any components that you're writing. For yourself, your past self might depend on something that your future self forgets about and changes underneath you, or your rest of your team, or you might just be producing reusable components for people you don't even know. They will depend on the undocumented parts of your API. The only way around that is to never expose those details in the first place. So, for example, here we have an abbreviated bit of a template from a monster stat block that's also going to expose a couple rollers for attacks and damage. The fact that this uses the dice roll elements doesn't need to be part of the stat block's public API. So this sort of attempt at styling the dice roll results off of the stat block won't work. Either way won't work. You can't style the results directly, and I cannot get a dice roll part, even though I exposed the dice roll part explicitly, and then go deeper into those parts, because we have no way of knowing ahead of time whether an author wants to expose those parts. We don't expose a lot of bits about it. You can't select based on tag name. You can't select based on classes or IDs. So being able to select based on the parts that it randomly exposes would be arbitrary amount of data leakage. So we don't let you do that, unless you want to, in which case you can say export parts. In this slightly modified example, I use the export parts attribute to say, for this first dice roller, I'm going to grab its result part and pull it up into the stat block. I'm also going to grab its result part and pull it up under the name attack. Same thing for the damage roll, except I'm going to name it damage. This name, comma, like old name, comma, new name lets you rename things to whatever you want to expose for your API, so you can change out what components you're using and still keep a stable API for users of your component. In this case now, the stuff works. As far as the user is concerned, your monster stat block element has a result part, and it has a damage result part, something with 2 names, because we did indeed export it with 2 names. Now, I'm not going to say that Shadow DOM is perfect. It's got some complexities to it, certainly. One of the big ones is that it still doesn't work great with React. They're doing better from what I understand. There's some changes on the horizon that'll make it work better, but it's choices they made early on in their tech stack that make it not very compatible. If you're using basically anything else in the world, though, it works pretty good. Most DOM handling libraries like this work on components and Shadow DOM natively, because this is the exact API we designed this API exactly for that case, to be able to ship interoperable components and not have to care about the ecosystem that you're buying into as much. You can swap ecosystems more easily. You can mix them because they're all based on Shadow DOM. So most of the time it's fine. If you're in React, sorry, hopefully it'll fix later. The other big problem is that encapsulation means encapsulation. You're hiding data from yourself. This is often useful. It's a great tool. It means that you can write simpler selectors. You don't have to worry about accidentally targeting things that you didn't predict. But it also means that you're going to have more difficulty targeting them when you do intend to. You have to be very explicit with it. So this is sort of tool that imposes some discipline on you. It requires being a little bit more careful and intentional with your stuff. But assuming that that works for you, assuming that design works, it's really, really useful. And you don't have to embrace it all the way. I used the dice roller examples here because it's tiny. It's a leaf node. It's very simple and easy. You're not going to do any big, complicated structures inside of there. You're supposed to pass a string that just says a little dice expression. That's the perfect use case for Shadow DOM when you're starting stuff. It's not going to interact with anything else. You don't care what it's doing otherwise. And you can design its API pretty reasonably just by thinking about it a little bit, because it's not that hard to start with. If you're doing more complicated stuff, like if you look into any of the things that Salesforce is doing, they are mega on web components and Shadow DOM, and they go deep, and it's worth it for them. It lets them design things in one team and use them in another team without having to have deep integration between those two teams. They use this as a great API contract layer, like a boundary between them that they can depend on, but it requires a lot of work on their part to make it happen. That said, we can do things easier too. The next one I'm going to talk about is scoping. This one, the spec is a little bit longer. It's not an easy name, but if you look for CSS Cascade 6, it's really the only text in there, but if you go directly to this anchor, it'll take you right to the section. Scoping does two things, really. I'm going to explain both of them because none of them make sense. It limits styles to a donut in your page, and it makes nesting more intuitive. What do I mean by either of those? Well, it's a pretty common pattern to have a container that has some amount of structure in it. You've got tabs, you've got a little heading, you've got an image on one side, and then you've got arbitrary content sitting inside of it. It's just used to wrap around stuff and do something with it, to style it, contextualize it, but it's got some bit that's arbitrary junk that you're not caring about. When you're styling this component, in this case, a media object that's meant to just set something next to an image or a video, you don't care what's in there. You don't want to care what's in there. CSS makes you care what's in there, though, because selectors go globally. So today, if you were to want to safely design some selectors to style the image and the video inside your media object, you've got two options. They both work. Neither of them are good. Here in this very simple example, it looks okay to do the first one. Just use a descendant or a child selector to target just that image. If the content has any images, it's going to be at least a grandchild, so you're not going to worry about it. But that only works so nicely because this is such a simple example. It's easy to imagine harder examples, longer examples that are too long to put on this slide easily, that would require a substantially longer selector structure. You have to do a lot of children or sibling selectors, and that's fragile. If you ever change your HTML, you've got to go rewrite all these selectors. Or one team does a slight tweak that they think is fine, and it breaks the styles that another team is writing. The other option then that a lot of people turn to is to just throw really specific classes on everything. then you don't have to worry about the exact structure because these names are more or less unique. Nothing else is going to use the name media object image. The problem here, of course, is that it's verbose as hell. You're repeating the name of things over and over again. Some people are how BEM works, for example, but we could do better than that. Come on. Not to mention, this doesn't actually work for a reason I will show momentarily. But first, we're going to keep talking about the donut. The scope at rule lets you solve this super, super easily. You specify a scope rule. You give two selectors, one for the upper bound of the donut, in this case, the media object, and one for the lower bound, the thing you don't want to search past. Then you just put selectors inside of it, just like inside of a media query or something. The trick is, of course, that these selectors will only match between the outer bound, or the upper bound, and the lower bound. So if you have an image or a video inside of your dot content, inside your whatever other stuff, these will not match those. Guaranteed. You didn't have to write anything defensively. You didn't have to depend on the structure. You know that there's only going to be one image in here, but you didn't have to carefully craft a selector that winds its way through your DOM structure to find it, just in case you accidentally hit something else. This just does exactly what you want. You can also select relative to the root once you've established it, if you need to. For example, this one, the lower boundary says, I only care about the content, I only care about that as a lower boundary if this media object is in the sidebar. So sidebar, the colon scope stands for whatever the upper boundary is, and then we finally declare the dot content. Works similarly otherwise, though. You can do whatever you need to with these complex selectors. Now, I said I'd mention why that second example didn't really work despite it being so common. And the reason is that nesting doesn't work in CSS. Not today. Here's a very simple example. Again, realistic examples are easy to construct, but they're hard to fit into a slide. So we're going with something very easy. You've got a couple of a page that can have light and dark elements on it. Basically doing light mode, dark mode. They can be arbitrarily nested. So then you produce a structure like this here. You've got a light div with a link in it. You've got a dark div with a link in it. You've got another light div with a link in it. What do you expect? We'll roll down this pretty quickly here. The outermost div, you would expect it to be styled with the light mode link color, blue. The dark div, you expect it to be colored with the dark mode link color, light blue. The light mode div, you expect it to be colored with the light mode dark color, but it's not. It's light again. Why is this? It's because CSS doesn't do nesting, actually. This link right here is a child of a light div. It is also a descendant of a dark div. Both of the selectors match, dark A and light A. And so, as you learned yesterday in Bramis's talk, if they tie otherwise, same origin, same specificity, same everything, the only thing that matters, the only thing that breaks ties is order of appearance. In this case, the dark style comes after, so it wins in the inner nested thing. This sucks. It's not what you want. This looks terrible. It's going to be unreadable. It also means you're deeply dependent on the order of your styles. If we just swapped the order of these, something that shouldn't matter at all, we get different results suddenly. The exact same problem that is causing the innermost one to be light colored is actually happening to the dark mode as well. It's a child of a dark and a descendant of a light. It's just that order of appearance happens to do the correct thing by accident. So we can fix this with scope again. The previous examples I gave a lower boundary because that's pretty important for that example, but you don't need to. You can just supply an upper boundary here. In this case, I'm going to say the scope is a .light container. Inside of there, I'm going to give the scoping element a white background, and I'm going to color the links blue. And inside of a dark scope, I'm going to give it a dark background and color the links light blue. And now, when you look at it, it works. It does the exact thing you want. It's perfect. Do not look at my source code. I'm cheating here because this is not actually supported yet, but this is what it will look like. And importantly, like I said, it's not only is the bottommost white one succeeding where it previously failed, the dark one is now succeeding for the right reason, because they're the same origin, they're the same specificity. And so the tiebreaker now is scoping. We look at the different, you got the two rules that work out, the light A and the dark A, and we look at where relative to the element those scoping roots are. For this bottommost one, the light is closer than the dark, so the light one wins. For the dark one, the dark is closer than the outermost light, so the dark wins. Very specifically, if you remember the list of categories that Bramis showed the other day, scoping proximity is the new thing that gets inserted into there. Below specificity, but above order of appearance. So this is a very weak tiebreaker. Everything else can defeat it. So you can still control how your styles work via standard specificity things, via cascade layers, via whatever mechanism you have today. But when all else is equal, scoping proximity will now do the thing that you always wanted it to do, and people often expect it to, and it simply can't today. There are a few caveats and questions still left in the spec. That's why it hasn't been shipped publicly yet. The most important one is where exactly should specificity live? Like I showed right now, it is below, or should proximity live? Right now it's below specificity. There's an argument to be made that it should be a stronger thing, that you should be able to do something a little bit closer to shadow DOM and declare that these styles scoped to this element win by default. But then you have to worry more about clashes. I think we're going to lean toward how it's written today, but there's still a possibility of something changing. There's also a few ideas in the spec about adapting scoping directly into the selector syntax rather than requiring that @ rule. Don't know how if that's going to proceed or not, and even if it does, we'll probably still work with the @ rule. So what you saw today should still be correct and useful when we finally do ship it. But Tab, I hear you say, didn't that last bit look a lot like nesting? What are you trying to pull? This is you. All of you are thinking it right now. And you're right. It does look a lot like nesting, but shitty. Luckily, we have the non-shitty version. CSS nesting. This draft is being written by me and Adam right now. CSS nesting, exactly what you would think. Nesting that looks almost as good as you'd get in Sass or any other preprocessor. So it does, in most cases, basically look like what you would expect from Sass. You make the, just to reuse the example from last time, you have a light container, give it a white background, and then target the links nested directly into it, with the ampersand being a new type of selector that represents the thing up above, just like in Sass. Probably in other ones, I don't know, I've never used them. You can also use @nest. Now, technically, the grammar of the @nest rule is that it's got a selector in its prelude, and then it's got styles in its block. In practice, all this means is you write a style rule and you slap the 6 characters in front of it, and it works. The important reason for this existing is that CSS parsing is really complicated. I wrote the syntax spec that put modern CSS parsing on a good basis. And, well, it's easier to explain with an example. Here we have the exact thing we were looking at before, a light with a background, and then what looks like a color property. I think most of us humans around here are going to be guided by the highlighting and assume that this is indeed a color property. And you would be right in this case, partially also because as a human, you can easily skip to the end of the line and see there's a semicolon, and that's a pretty good indicator that this is a property. But if you don't see the semicolon yet, if you are a browser parsing this character by character, token by token, what you see is something that might be a property name or might be a type selector, followed by a var pseudoclass with some other stuff. It's not until you get to the id and you see the semicolon indicating a property or a curly brace indicating a style rule, you can actually tell. And this is a problem. It's not a problem for every tool. Sass doesn't care about this problem. They don't have to, because it's not a big perf problem if you are rarely running the parser. But when you're doing complex real-time parsers with very tight constraints on how long that they can run and parsing enormous documents, people don't want to wait an extra quarter second to see their timeline on Twitter just because we're spending a long time parsing their CSS. They want it as fast as possible, and they should get it as fast as possible. And when you're writing a parser, If you only have to look a few tokens ahead to tell which way you're going to be parsing something, it's fine. There's fast algorithms for that. There's a lot of pre-computation you can do that makes it work well. But in this case, you can't. You can have an arbitrary amount of text before you see the thing that tells you it's a property or it's a style rule and lets you know which way you should be parsing, which parser method you should be calling on it. That's a problem. There's no fast way to handle that. You just got to do it the slow way. Try it once. If that fails, try it again. And that's not going to be great for people. So at the moment, at least, browser vendors aren't willing to handle that. And so by using @nest, you guarantee that they can tell right away. The very first token can see, oh, that's an @rule. We're going to parse it like a rule. If it's not an @rule, we're going to parse it like a property. Done. Easy peasy. This also means then that we can do a couple of compromises. Because just a moment ago, I showed an example that I implied was correct that didn't have the @nest in it. Why does that work? Because it's got an ampersand. We don't use the ampersand anywhere else. That means that it's a selector. So the rule that is currently written in the spec is that if you start with an ampersand, it's okay. You can just nest that directly. If you do anything else, for example, if you want to precede the ampersand with something to select on context, you got to put it in an @nest. Or if you're doing a selector list and not all of them use the ampersand or use them all in the front, you got to do it in a nest. Even if the first one's there, we want to make sure that if you edit your CSS later, you don't accidentally break stuff just because you removed the one that started with it. So there's a few options on the ground right now for what to do about this. This is the big blocker that's keeping CSS nesting from advancing at the moment. We'll be getting through with it soon. Basically, me and Adam we're busy with other things, but we'll be dealing with it pretty soon. I'll link just a second. There is a CSS working group issue that we would love your feedback in. I'm one author. I have my opinion on what I like best, but I could be wrong. I can be convinced otherwise. But I'll give a quick summary of the 3 options that are currently likely to be on the field. The first one is what I've been showing you. It's what's in the spec right now, where if you start with an ampersand, you're good. Otherwise, you put an @nest. The second one is just slightly simpler. You always put an @nest. Done. No thinking. You just got to deal with it. It's a couple of extra characters at the start of every rule, but you don't have to worry about, is this selector in the right form or not. The third is you just shape the context entirely. Nest them again into a plain curly brace so we can tell everything inside of there is definitely going to be style rules. We don't have to worry about parsing ambiguity. The problem here is it's 2 indents deep. If you go 3 levels of nested, which is not unusual in Sass code bases, now you're 6 indents deep instead of 3 like you would be in Sass or in either of the other options. I personally think that's pretty bad, but I can be convinced otherwise, like I said. So if y'all have opinions on this, feel free to follow along at that link. And that's it for my talk then. I did indeed run a little bit under, which I thought I would, because I always go like 25% faster. So thank you all very much. Again, the talk is at today's date, /talk/today's date. And thank you very much.
That was great. Ted, please proceed to the conversation corner. Plenty of questions for you, sir.
Excellent.
So, let's start off with a very short one from Peter. Any news about CSS Houdini?
The answer to CSS Houdini is that other browsers still haven't done a lot of work with it, and I've been working on other things. I work on so much stuff, and it's just not been my top priority lately. I've been working on a couple other new things. You might have heard about anchor positioning or shared element transitions. That's been my latest little bits. And it's just one project among many. That said, it's still trucking. There's nothing going wrong with it, so it'll happen.
So you did mention that you're working through some blockers for nesting. So I'm personally very excited for scoping and nesting, but because it's still being worked on, realistically, what's the ballpark you think we can actually start seeing implementations?
So as always, I can never give exact dates just because nobody knows them. And we don't have any, I know for a fact we have no implementers working on them at this moment. But I know that scope is on our timeline for this year to start working on. Again, no promises, but that's the plan. And nesting will be as well as soon as we resolve the syntax question, for sure.
Amazing. Looking forward to that. Okay, Christian Schaefer has a question. Do you know what the other browser vendors think of the idea of declarative shadow DOM, and couldn't that be a topic for Interop 2023?
Yeah, it would be great, wouldn't it? I've been wanting declarative shadow DOM since we started talking about shadow DOM. The fact that we have to turn to JavaScript for such a simple thing, I'm not doing anything fancy there besides attaching an event listener. Okay, I can do that in some JS, but most of it, a lot of stuff that you might want to do with shadow DOM doesn't need any JavaScript at all, except we force it on you. There's some technical issues. There's been just some reticence from a few browsers on dealing with this. It's a complicated topic, I understand, but it'll happen someday. We keep pushing on it. And I'm not sure exactly when. That's definitely something that is a someday topic, not a soon topic.
Got it. Priorities, right? Since there's so much to work on. Here's one. It's not directly related to CSS, but you suggested to use more custom elements and shadow DOMs, and Dennis personally likes this, but at their agency, they've got an ongoing discussion about web components and SEO. Do you have any opinions about that?
That's a great question. So, well, the simple answer is don't worry about what web tech you're using. If it matters for Google search, they'll adapt. Google runs, the bot runs JavaScript, so it figures stuff out. That's the usual pattern. Just don't worry about it. If it matters, we'll fix the algorithm. I have no idea what effect it would have on the algorithm right now. I'm sure that people who actually pay attention to that actually do know what effects, if any, it has. But if it's bad, make noise. We'll figure it out. It'll get fixed.
Make noise
Always
is the point he's raising here. So Bart Veneman has a question. Will every shadow DOM style tag be available in document.stylesheets for reading or manipulation?
None of them are available in document.stylesheets, actually. They are available on the shadowroot.stylesheets. That is another bit of encapsulation. We don't expose anything unless you ask for it. Now, I declared an open shadow root there, so it's easy to descend into. Anyone on the page can just grab the element, go into its shadow root, and fiddle around with whatever they need. You can also do it in a closed mode, which is a fig leaf. It kind of hides it, but you can actually extract the shadow root if you want, as it's silly. But yeah, everything on the shadow root is like a little tiny document. So everything that you get off of document, you get off shadow root instead.
Okay. Oh, another not strictly CSS question. So Christian asks, why can't I isolate JavaScript inside a shadow DOM similar to styles? And why do certain events bubble through the barrier, but some do not?
Right. Okay. So two questions there. First, isolating JavaScript is an active topic of discussion at TC39 right now. Look for realms. That's the topic you want to be searching for. So the ability to execute isolated JavaScript in a safe way, especially in today's world of Spectre and other process attacking sort of code stuff, is a very difficult thing. There's a lot of much easier routes that we thought would be fine, and it turns out, no, you can just steal arbitrary information from a process if you're sufficiently clever. So we're still working on it over in TC39. Not me, I don't know anything about this, but smarter people than me on that topic are doing stuff. And I'm certain that it will apply to Shadow DOM at some point, maybe via an opt-in mode, maybe you just do it and it works at some point. The second part of the question, though, remind me what that was.
So it is, why do certain events bubble through the barrier, but some do not?
The answer is probably just that some events make sense to bubble through and others don't. If you get a click event, you're going to want to know where that click is regardless, generally. You can swallow it on purpose, cancel it, prevent it from escaping. But generally speaking, the outer page is going to want to know where something got clicked, even if it's inside of a shadow DOM. But some other events don't matter. Like I think composition events might not bubble out. I don't know exactly. If you know what events actually do it, I'm sorry if I'm being completely off. but it's just a matter of which events are more sensible to contain in there versus exposing to the outer page. Again, because we want to encapsulate. We want to hide details if we can. So it just depends on the thing. Also, maybe the answer is people just set it up wrong and didn't think very much about it, in which case, make some noise and we can fix it.
Again, that magic word, noise.
Bug reports, issue reports on GitHub, whatever it is that you want to get to. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very great point, and many speakers have emphasized, like, you can contribute, you can GitHub is pretty much the avenue in which you can communicate back to folks in the working group, browsers, and so on.
Yeah.
And
or
then,
bug trackers for the browsers directly. Yeah.
So those are like the formal ones. And if you want to navigate the swamp that is social media, Twitter is an option.
Yeah,
right?
I answer questions on Twitter all the time. Absolutely.
So, right. Is there any way that browsers could retrofit parts to be exposed for existing HTML? So non-custom elements like, say, select or input, and allow authors to like kind of style those elements via that?
Yes. So again, I'm going to answer this in two parts. The first one is, yes, we absolutely could. There's nothing preventing us from exposing user agent defined parts on those sorts of things. And in fact, several elements do explicitly use Shadow DOM internally, an actually hidden version, like the video element is pure Shadow DOM. That's why you can't see anything inside of it. It just looks like a video element with nothing in it. That said, styling things in particular, like selects and other inputs and whatnot, is still such a difficult topic because look at how different they are on different phones versus desktop and how they've historically changed around. A select multiple instead looks like a checkbox list on some phones. It's very difficult to come up with a model of parts that works well across all the ways we want to allow some of these to be exposed. That said, it was mentioned yesterday, OpenUI is working on this exact problem, and they have some great approaches to it that let us address a large part of what's going on here. It's not quite as simple as using parts. It's mostly reinventing, but in a way that makes sense so that the browser can understand properly and expose it to accessibility APIs properly. But still, it gets the job done. So look up stuff that OpenUI is doing. They're working in this space very well right now.
That's great. Like, from these 2 days, I'm hearing a lot of these questions that, like, I think the average developer is like, it's this black box, like all these standards people are hiding in the dungeon, in their cauldron, like bubbling stuff, but it's actually very open. And I think there is a marketing issue here, like it's not widespread knowledge that it's so open.
That you can just tweet at anybody. Yeah.
So yeah, that's something to keep in mind. And like, it's something that we should all like share far and wide. It's like, they're not wizards hiding in a dungeon. It's like, they probably might be next to you. Like, look left.
Yeah. I didn't talk about my history in this talk, but I didn't join Google and then begin working on CSS. I was a normal ass web developer in Texas and just doing web dev to get off the tech support phones. And while teaching myself how to do HTML, I came across the fact that standards bodies exist in the first place. I lurked, I started contributing. Eventually, I was like, this gradient spec that Apple produced sucks, I can make a better one. I did make a better one, and they were like, hey, please join the CSS working group. And then I finally got hired at Google to do that. But I was been producing standards work for 2 years before, purely just because it was interesting. Anyone can do that. It doesn't always pay off. It's something that takes a lot of patience and the ability to say like, yeah, I guess that idea didn't pan out. Well, next one perhaps. But if you have the patience to get through something and the urge to do it, the drive, you can accomplish a lot. A lot of stuff that we're doing now is explicitly because somebody else was like, I really want this, and I'm going to keep bugging y'all until it happens.
And thank you so much, Tab, for answering all these questions. And if you have more questions, Tab is a very accessible human being.
Yeah.
So please shoot your questions at him. Round of applause again for Tab Atkins.
Thank you.